So I hinted at this a little bit earlier, but I want to take a minute to unpack this idea of implicit versus explicit measures. Now in Power BI, in the report view, implicit measures are created when you drag raw numerical fields like order quantity from our sales data table, into the values pane of a visual. Now what Power BI does is automatically select and apply an aggregation mode, usually a sum, so that you can view those numbers, those values, in a meaningful way. And that's exactly what's been going on with all of the values that we've been looking at in the matrix views that we've built. Now, on the other hand, explicit measures are created by actually entering DAX functions, or which we're not going to do, quick measures, to explicitly define calculated columns or measures. So, very important difference here. Implicit measures are only accessible within the specific visualization in which they're created. You can't reference that sum of order quantity anywhere else. Same exact idea as a calculated field in an Excel pivot table. It can only be accessed and analyzed in that place. But what's great about explicit measures is that they can be used anywhere in the report once you create them, and referenced within other DAX calculations to create more complex formulas, or something that we call measure trees. So for instance, if we wanted to take the sum of order quantity and then nest that within another function, like total orders minus total returns, to come up with net orders or something similar, we would have to create an explicit measure in order to access those component values. So let's jump into Power BI and I'll show you what I mean. All right, so we're back in the report pane of our Power BI AdventureWorks report, just like we left it. And here we're looking at order quantities and return quantities by product keys. And now again, if you look at the actual details, you'll see that it's defaulted to an aggregation mode of a sum in both of these cases. And that's kind of the standard behavior when you drag in a numerical field like this. So let's get rid of return quantity, but keep this version of order quantity in here. I'm just going to drag this closer. And now the idea is that I want to create a proper explicit measure to capture that same idea, that same sum of order quantity. But I then want to be able to use and access that sum in other measures and calculations down the line. So I'm going to show you a couple approaches like we talked about. Number one, I could go into modeling and click new measure. And you see what happened when I did that? It created a new line item, a new field for this measure, and it placed it in the AW calendar lookup table, since that's the first one in our field list. And I'm trying to create a measure related to the sum of order quantity, so it doesn't make any sense whatsoever for that measure to live in the calendar lookup, which is why I don't recommend using that approach, using the modeling tab to create your measures. So instead of even typing it in here, I'm going to go ahead and X out, which just cancels that. And instead, I'm going to right click on the sales table or anywhere within the sales table. And I'm going to choose new measure from that menu. Now it's added the measure, assigned it to the sales table where it makes a lot more sense to live. So to define this, I'm going to give it a name. Let's call it quantity sold. And it's okay to use spaces in measures. They're always going to be reflected in formulas surrounded by brackets. So in this case, spaces don't really have any negative impact. And in fact, they can often make them a bit more readable. So we're going to do quantity sold with a space equals the sum of the order quantity column. And again, this IntelliSense, this autocomplete functionality is really user-friendly. So I'm just going to literally start typing order. And I see that there are 4 columns within the AW sales table that begin with order. And we want order quantity. So I can either arrow down and tab, or I can click and then double click again to lock it in. So it's really as simple as that. The sum function has one argument, it's the column name. So I can close the parenthesis and press enter. And now looking over at our field list, it's created a new field here called quantity sold. Now let's grab that, pull it in right under our order quantity, and you'll see that it returns the exact same numbers, which is good. That's exactly what we want here. But again, the first version, the implicit version of this sum, cannot be accessed outside of this visual, whereas the measure version of the sum, which we've named quantity sold, can. And that's what makes it way more powerful and way more flexible. So one of the best practices that we're going to talk more about is to create explicit measures even for very simple things that you could define with the auto aggregation available implicitly. Getting in the habit of using explicit measures will only make things easier for you down the road. So there you go. That's a simple example of creating our first true explicit measure. If we did want to move or reassign that measure, this is where you do it. This little properties group in the modeling tab, you can just click the home table and assign it somewhere else. In this case, it makes sense to live in the sales table since we're aggregating a sales specific field. And you'll probably notice that you're seeing different kinds of icons next to the field in the field list. The one that we just created, the measure, has a little calculator icon next to it. That's always going to be your indication of a calculated measure, whereas the order quantity has that sigma symbol next to it because it's a raw numerical field. And you also have a different icon with the little FX, looks like a small table, that indicates a calculated column. So we have all three types here within our AW sales data. So there you go. That's your first explicit measure. Congratulations.